All right, welcome everybody to Bio 1. So, this is biology for non majors, and this is going to be the first lecture video that goes along with your reading and all of your assignments. And all of the lecture videos will be embedded in the modules that will be assigned to you all throughout the semester, just like this video that you're watching now. So, if you have any questions about how to access or watch these lecture videos, please feel free to email me and let me know. And you also can find the PowerPoints that I will be going over in these lecture videos in the files section on Canvas. And all of those videos will be uploaded in PowerPoint format. Okay. All right. So with this first lecture video, we're going to be going through an introduction of biology and the study of life. And so biology really is the scientific study of living organisms. And we're basically going to define in this chapter exactly what living organisms are, how we classify living organisms, and we do that based off of several different properties. So basically, what that thing does and how it interacts with its environment, and we use those as so we use those characteristics really as a metric to determine if something is classified as living or not. We'll talk about the different levels of biological organization. We'll look at how we go about doing science and conducting science. And really, a lot of us use the scientific method on a daily basis. You just don't think about it as the scientific method. And we'll go over some examples of that. We'll talk about inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And then we'll just kind of look at some ideas of basic science and applied science. And so first, there are a wide array of living organisms around the globe. If you've ever watched Animal Planet or Discovery Channel or any of those nature shows, they really do a good job of showcasing just the vast diversity of unique and really just amazing organisms that are found all around the globe. And biology really is studying all of those living organisms and all of the diversity. So the diversity in a simplistic concept is just all the different forms of the living organisms. Now, diversity, when you break it down, is a little bit more complex, but we're kind of not going to go over that detail in this class. But so for diversity, you just want to basically think of it as all of the different species around the globe. And biology is really studying all of those living things. And so I want you to just kind of take a minute when I move to this next slide. You can pause it if you need to, and think about how many different living things you actually can identify in this slide. Okay, so just take a minute, pause the video if you need to. Okay, so what are some things that you might have identified? Maybe some trees, the grass, the human, the person that is um, reading at the base of the tree here. Excuse me. And so those are probably some of the more obvious living organisms in this picture. Okay. What about some of the not so obvious living organisms? There are microbes that live on the trees and in the grass. There's living organisms on the person's skin, bacteria. There's animals living in the trees that you probably can't see. And so, think about the other, living organisms that are associated with the trees and the grass that are not apparently obvious, right? And so if you think about that and then we look back at this picture, there's actually what actually seems like simplistic picture in terms of living organisms, actually at a more complex level, there's a lot of diversity actually here in this picture, especially when you start breaking it down into species and not actually just types of organisms. And so what that means then is, how do we actually classify these things as living? Why do we say a tree is alive, or a certain species of bacteria or microbe? And then the very big discussion of whether or not viruses are alive or not, based off of specific characteristics. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how we actually classify things as living. And this little animation here kind of goes over this, and then we're going to kind of discuss it in more detail.
Life on Earth, all living things, bacteria, archaea, protists, fungi, plants, and animals, share common traits that are associated with life. No single definition applies to all forms of life, so instead of defining life, we can only characterize it. Most biologists agree that in general, the following statements characterize life. First, living things contain nucleic acids, proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. The nucleic acid DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is especially important because DNA molecules can be replicated, an ability that enables organisms to reproduce themselves. Second, living things are composed of cells. Cells are the smallest units of life. Some organisms have only a single cell, others are multicellular. Humans, for example, are composed of trillions of cells. Third, living things reproduce. Living things have ways of generating new individuals that carry some of the genetic material of the parents. Some organisms, such as bacteria, reproduce simply by making new and virtually exact copies of themselves. Fourth, living things use energy and raw materials. Through metabolic activities, organisms extract energy from various nutrients and transform it to do many kinds of work, allowing the organism to maintain life and grow. Fifth, living things respond. A snail, for example, detects the pressure of touch and responds by retracting into its shell. Sixth, living things maintain homeostasis, the relatively constant and self-correcting internal environment of a living organism. A snake remains cool by finding shade, a behavioral means of maintaining homeostasis. Animals also have physiological means to maintain homeostasis. For example, humans sweat to remain cool. Seventh, populations of living things evolve and have adaptive traits. In a process called natural selection, members of a population possessing beneficial genetic traits will survive and reproduce better than members of the population that lack these traits. In the case of the giraffe, a classic explanation for the long neck is that it's an adaptive trait for eating leaves that other animals may not be able to reach. Another explanation, however, is that male giraffes with longer necks can win fights with males having shorter necks, and thereby gain greater access to females.
Okay, so that video went over several different characteristics or properties that we use to classify something as being living or alive. And the different properties that the video went over were cellular organization, sensitivity to stimuli or the environment, so responding to the environment, regulation, and this regulation is also referred to as or related to homeostasis. And homeostasis is probably a new word for you guys. It's one that you may or may not be familiar with. And it's basically maintaining a stable or constant internal environment. So for us, for humans, we maintain a constant temperature. We have a maintenance of a pH level in our bodies. We maintain certain levels of water, salt, etc. So all of the processes in our body help to maintain or regulate that state of homeostasis. A living organism will be able to grow and develop. They also will process energy, and they are able to reproduce and generate offspring. And then the final thing is that a living organism is able to evolve and adapt. So they are able to be fit or generate traits. Not generate, generate's a bad word. They are able to um, be really successful in their environment. So, for example, if you have a uh, a group of mice or rabbits, and let's say these rabbits live in the Arctic Circle, a rabbit that has a seasonal coat color, so meaning that they are darker, maybe brown in the summertime to blend in with the summer environment, and their coat color changes to a white color in the wintertime to blend in with the snow, are going to survive better than those who don't have a seasonal coat. So maybe there's a species or a group of rabbits that maintain that brown coat color year round, and so they kind of stick out in the wintertime against the snow, and that makes predators will be able to attack and find those individuals better. So the ones who can change their coat color to match their background will be better adapted to that environment, and therefore they will be much more successful. And so just kind of going into these properties in a little more detail. So the first thing is order. So basically all living things are complex. There's a lot of complexity to the organ systems and the tissues and the way an organism's body works and functions. But really, if you look at it and dissect it, they're all organized into different components, or the process is compartmentalized, and there's a lot of organization to how living things are put together and developed, I guess you could say. And whenever you think of a living example of organization, there are a lot of different things that could pop up. But, think of how cells are organized into tissues. And then those tissues are then organized into, say, organs. And we'll talk a little bit about that during the organization of life, or the hierarchy of life here in a couple minutes. But basically, again, there's this structured organization to the different components of living organisms. And even if you look at a forest, species and individuals are organized in terms of what habitat they use, what they eat, what resources they take advantage of. They partition those types of factors, and so that really allows them to be able to survive and coexist with one another. You also have the sensitivity or responding to the environment. So organisms will respond to stimuli and other environmental factors in a lot of different ways. You could have positive responses and negative responses. So a positive response would be moving towards a stimulus. And so, for example, if we open this video here, actually, I don't think you guys will be able to see it because I'm not sharing that page, but in your own time, click on this video and you will actually see these bacteria going towards this black dot. And this black dot is a little sugar crystal. And so that would be a positive stimulus. A negative stimulus would be if the bacteria were moving away from that crystal. So a negative stimulus, another example of a negative stimulus would be, say, sunlight. And as a person, whenever you get hot, you move out of the sunlight. So you're moving away from that. You're moving into the shade. So that would be a negative response to the increased heat of the solar radiation. Other responses to environmental factors or changes could be migration events, so birds migrating, such as this example here. So these are thousands and thousands of individuals of different bird species, maybe even the same species migrating. The Central Valley of California is a big migration area for waterfowl and lots of other migratory species that travel from Alaska to South America and Mexico from through different seasonal periods. And other examples of responses to stimuli are things like plants. Plants, if you've noticed, will kind of bend to the sunlight. If they are, kind of blocked on one side, they'll bend their structure in order to take sun from a different area. If you've ever had plants in front of a window, you might have noticed that those plants will kind of bend towards the window so that they can get increased sunlight, so that they can have more photosynthesis. And so those are just some examples of way or the ways living things can respond to the environmental conditions. The third factor is regulation. And a regulation, again, is tied to homeostasis, maintaining that stable, steady internal state. And so if you look at this lizard here, he's basking, or it is basking on a rock, basking in the sun. And so the reason that they do this is so that they can warm up their body. And by warming up their body, their internal temperature warms up, their metabolism increases, they're able to move faster because their cellular processes are working faster, and so they're able to run and catch predators than if it were cold. If you've ever come across a reptile on a cold morning, you might have noticed that they move really sluggish, and that's because their body is not warmed up yet. So they need to bask in that sun to regulate that internal temperature. And there are two different ways really that you can regulate, or a living organism will regulate its internal temperature. The first is through what we call ectothermic regulation, not ectothermic. And you might have heard this referred to as being cold-blooded. So it's basically where the organism's body temperature is the same temperature as its surrounding environment, which would be a reptile. When it's cool, its body temperature is cool. When it's warm, its body temperature is warm. So it's correlated to the temperature outside or around it. The second way is endothermic, which is how we regulate our body temperature. And so you heard that referred to as warm-blooded probably. And basically that's regulated through metabolic processes. So our cells, through metabolism, generate heat. We also sweat to help cool us off. We shiver whenever we get cold. And so all of those physiological processes help maintain our body at a steady internal temperature. And again, this steady state that both of these processes are striving to keep is homeostasis. So just to maintain that constant internal condition. This picture here shows just kind of some adaptations of an endothermic organism. So this is an elephant. And if you notice, there are warm and cool parts found in the body in this thermal image. And so what's really cool about elephants is you can see here on their ear, there is this area, let me get my pointer, where you can actually see the blood vessels are warmer than the flesh of the ear, this fleshy part of the ear. Basically, this is called a thermal window. So if the elephant is hot, it can route blood into these blood vessels, and since the ear is very thin, the heat will dissipate rapidly out of the ear, so the elephant can cool itself that way. However, if it's cold, it can reduce the amount of blood flow into its ear, and it can help keep that heat inside of its body and not lose it through that heat dissipation. And so that's just like a really cool example of what we call thermal windows and adaptations of organisms to help regulate their body. One of my favorite examples, actually, of thermal windows. Um, Another property of living organisms is growth and development. So growth is fairly obvious. You just grow, you increase in size. Development is basically changes in the body as it goes through different life stages and it develops different aspects of its physical and cellular structure. Um, and the growth and development of an organism is directly tied to the DNA. It's tied to the instructions in the DNA, so those codons, which we'll talk about in the DNA chapter, and that directly translates to how the organism will grow and how that organism will develop. Another characteristic that you need to be familiar with is energy processing. So energy processing is basically organisms take in organic molecules or make their own organic molecules that will be used for energy. Autotrophs, which are things like plants, will convert solar radiation into chemical energy through the process of photosynthesis. So they can make their own chemical energy. Heterotrophs, however, cannot make their own chemical energy. So they have to take in organic molecules, usually by eating other organic organisms, in order to get that chemical energy, mainly glucose, so sugars, carbohydrates, those sorts of molecules, which we'll learn about in chapter 2. And the energy that they obtain or make can be stored and also can be used at a later time when needed. And so if you think about it, for humans, we obtain energy by eating plants, eating animal products, eating meat, and we get the glucose and the sugars out of it, and that is the organic molecule that we use for energy production to run our cellular processes. Reproduction is another property of living organisms, so they have to be able to reproduce to generate offspring of its own kind. And that mechanism is really important because it's passing genes from parent to offspring. It's allowing for those properties that make the organism successful, those characteristics that make the organism successful to be passed on. There's two different ways reproduction can happen. You can have asexual reproduction, which is just where things like single-celled organisms will divide and form two identical daughter cells. So like we have binary fission of an amoeba here at the bottom. And then you can also have sexual reproduction where two gametes fuse together, sperm and eggs, for example, and they generate a zygote or an embryo that will then grow into an adult. And so that again is passing genes down to the next generation. It's just one asexual reproduction results in a genetically identical offspring, whereas sexual reproduction results in a genetically different individual for their offspring. And then the final property for classifying living organisms is the process of evolution. And so evolution and adaptation are actually, we're going to combine these. And so basically adaptation is where you have characteristics in an organism that make them more fit for their environment. So they're more successful in that type of environment. So for example, we talked about the rabbit coat color. We also could use mice coat colors, like in this image down here. So you notice that initially you have an even distribution of white mice and gray mice, but as predators are more able to see the individuals that contrast against their environment, these white mice, they begin to be predated on by those predators. And so in the final population, you have more individuals of gray mice than white mice. So this gray coat color is an adaptation for this population of mice. And over time, the population will evolve from being white and gray mice, 50-50, to being mostly gray mice. And so the characteristics of those individuals in the population change over time. And so that's basically what evolution is. Evolution is that change over time. Adaptation is the characteristics that favor that change or that are being selected for through that change or process. And so, for example, you could think about an adaptation that a cactus may need in a desert. And so maybe it needs tissues that can store water. Maybe it needs ways to, not dissipate heat a lot faster and to help keep the tissues a lot cooler as it's in the solar radiation much more often than, say, an organism that lives in the Arctic or boreal regions of the globe. Okay, and so that is so those are the characteristics and the properties that are what we use to classify organisms as being alive. Whenever we have an organism that's classified as living, so life, we can then divide life into different levels of organization. We can go from really simplistic components of life to this all-encompassing, more complex interactions of life. And the simplest component are atoms. And then the all-inclusive, more complex level of life is the biosphere. And so basically what we have here is most complex going to least complex. And as you gain complexity, you end up seeing emergent properties arise. And emergent properties are really this idea of the whole being greater than the sum of its parts. So think about a cell. So a cell has a lot of different organelles. It has a nucleus, it has ribosomes. So these may be unfamiliar terms, but we'll learn about in chapter 3. But so they have nucleus, they have ribosomes, they have like Golgi apparatus, they have endoplasmic reticulum, they have a plasma membrane. So they have all these components that make a cell work. Now, if you have these individual components separated, they don't really function together. You don't get this living cell. But as soon as you put all of these things together, you get the workings and the functioning of a living cell. So that's emergent properties. So basically properties that aren't really apparent but come up when you put these parts together. And these emergent properties really determine interactions between individuals and how a system is structured. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start at the lowest level of life, and we're going to work our way up to the most complex form or level of living organisms. So first we have atoms and molecules. So atoms are your simplest form of elements. So like carbon, hydrogen, oxygen. And all of those atoms are arranged in different ways. So for they can be arranged in a lot of different ways. So if we look at a DNA molecule, DNA contains carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, nitrogen, and they're arranged together in this form here to where you get that double helix pattern, okay? So that DNA shape. And so all of these individual atoms can be put together to make a DNA molecule. So atoms make molecules. So a molecule is a group of atoms. And then once you get a molecule, you can have other molecules form together to make monomers. And so, for example, a glucose molecule and another glucose molecule can make a what's called a disaccharide, which we'll learn about in the next chapter. And then once you have your macromolecules, those macromolecules, those larger molecules, can come together and they'll form cells. So your muscle cell that's shown here is made up of a lot of different molecules. And then you can have a bunch of these muscle cells come together to make a muscle. And so your cells and your organelles that are in cells will form to produce different tissues, okay? But within your cells, So again, they're like a single muscle cell. Within their cells, there could be two different types of cells. You can have a prokaryotic cell, which is a single-celled organism. They're small. They're a lot simpler in structure compared to the second type of cell we're going to talk about. There's no nucleus inside of the cell. It's actually just concentrated in a single region called a nucleoid region, so shown here. And then it really doesn't have a lot of the complex organelles. It has ribosomes, really not much else. Whereas a eukaryotic cell is much larger. So this is a lot larger than this prokaryotic cell that is shown in this picture. Okay. And this eukaryotic cell also is much more complex. It has organelles, it has a nucleus. They can form multicellular they can be made up to form multicellular organisms, and they have a nucleus that's enclosed by a membrane. Okay, so much different or much more complex than this single-celled prokaryotic bacteria. So you have your prokaryotic cells and then your eukaryotic cells, and all of these are within that cellular level of life. And again, once you have multiple cells put together, they can be then they form tissues. And your tissues are made up of all of these different cells that have a similar function. Okay. And so an organ will then be made up of several different tissues. So far we've got atoms that make up molecules. You have molecules that make up macromolecules. Then you have your macromolecules that will make up a cell. And then multiple cells make up tissues. And then tissues with the same function will make up an organ. So for example, your heart is an organ that is made up of cardiac muscle tissue and a couple of other types of tissues. And so if you look at this cardiac muscle slide image here, you actually can see the different cells. So these lines here are separating cells. So this area right here is one cell. This area is another cell. You have this being a cell. And so all of that cardiac muscle tissue is made up of multiple different cells. Once you have an organ, then you can get multiple organs put together to make up an organ system. So the circulatory system is made up of organs such as the heart, arteries, veins, capillaries that help to transport blood throughout the body. When you have multiple organ systems, so like the circulatory system, the nervous system, the integumentary system, the digestive system, the reproductive system, the respiratory system. Once all of those organ systems are put together, they make up an individual. And an individual, an example like this iguana here, is the organism of focus. Humans, could be a peacock, it could be a coyote, etc. Right? So an organism is that single individual made up of all of the different organ systems. Now, when you have multiple individuals of the same kind of organism or species, so all of the iguanas make up a population, and they're in the same area, okay? So all of these iguanas on this island make up a population. All of the crabs on this island make up a population. All of the barnacles stuck to these rocks make up a population. So you actually have several different populations in this image. But again, a population is a group of organisms from the same species in the same area. Now, whenever you get multiple populations together, like in this image, so the population of iguanas, the population of crabs, population of barnacles, those together interacting with one another make a community. So a community is a group of populations in the same area that are interacting with one another. Now you can have multiple different communities come together to make up an ecosystem. And another important component is that an ecosystem also includes the non-living environment. So before now, we were focused on that living component, that living aspect. But now, once you get to an ecosystem, you're now including things like temperature, precipitation, soils, solar radiation, acidity of the ground, right? So all of those non-living factors that are interacting with the living components of that community or population make up an ecosystem. And then once you have all of the ecosystems combined, that makes up the globe or the biosphere, okay? And so just to kind of summarize, right, where's that image at? You have atoms that make molecules. Molecules will make organelles, and organelles and other molecules will make cells. Cells will make tissues. Tissues will make organs and organ systems. Those organs and organ systems will make organisms. Organisms together will make populations. Multiple populations make communities. Communities with the abiotic environment will make ecosystems. And then all of your ecosystems make up the biosphere. Okay. Okay. And what's important with discussing ecosystems is that living organisms are constantly interacting with their environment. They interact continuously with both the living factors, so other organisms or other species, individuals of the same species, and then also those non-living factors that we just discussed. And so, again, that ecosystem is the living organisms in a specific area with those non-living factors. And ecosystems are really dynamic. They depend on a lot of or a couple of different processes, but they're this kind of complex, lots of interactions, lots of nutrient cycling, energy flowing through the ecosystem. So like your food pyramid. So there are these really dynamic entities. So within these ecosystems, you have nutrients being recycled, energy flowing through, and how that happens is really important and kind of really determines how an ecosystem is going to function and actually thrive. Nutrients are recycled. So this is an important thing. Nutrients can be recycled through an ecosystem, but energy flow is one way. So energy is constantly being lost, so you can't recycle the energy. However, you can recycle the nutrients. And so energy mainly comes from the influx of solar radiation. So energy comes in, it is turned into organic molecules through photosynthesis, and we'll talk about this in the next couple of chapters, but energy comes in, turned into organic molecules in the plants. Then animals will eat those plants. They'll take up some of that energy. But then energy is always being lost as heat. So when you are active, you're converting that ATP, that chemical energy, into energy to run your cellular processes. But you get hot, you release that energy as heat. And so heat's being lost to the environment. And so energy, therefore, is one way. It can't be recycled, whereas nutrients can be recycled. So, for example, nitrogen can be in the soils, and then plants can take up that nitrogen, put it into their leaves. An animal can eat that leaf, take the nitrogen from that leaf, and put it into, say, an amino acid. And then when that animal dies, the amino acid will break down through decomposition, and that nitrogen will go back into the soil. And so in that aspect, nutrients can cycle through ecosystems, but energy is just one-way flow. Okay. All right, and so this does it for kind of the first section of the module. The next video for section 2, we're going to look at the scientific method, and we are going to also talk about phylogenetics a little bit, and and carry on and finish with the first chapter. So we'll see you then.